is the second seminar from Earthshot Labs. We've been hosting a number of different seminars from each of our project teams. And just a little summary on what we're up to at Earthshot Labs. And also I'll do an intro on my dear friend Dror. And we'll jump into a presentation that he has around regenerative urban design. And then we'll have a period of half an hour to 20 minutes of Q&A and more discussion. So Earthshot Labs is a pretty recent project. We started late November 2020. The community's grown to around 500 people and around 50 really active contributors. And it's primarily has been a project for identifying high leverage points in scaling nature-based climate solutions. I don't need to convince anyone here that climate and ecological restoration is one of the most important challenges of our time. And we need to bring the scale of solutions to the size of the problem. And a little background on myself. So I'm also a co-founder at Rhizome. We manufacture bamboo engineered lumber and founded Earthshot Labs with Patrick, who's also in this meeting. He can do a little intro on himself as well. And so far, right now, we have about 7 project teams, and we're working on soil carbon, forestry carbon, water restoration, and a bunch of other data science projects to essentially make an accurate model of global ecosystems and then provide options for landowners, policymakers, and investors to make better decisions to optimize land in a regenerative way rather than the ways we've been doing it. One of the leading edge themes that we haven't really addressed in the group so far is urban design. Obviously, the built environment has a massive impact on the world, at least a third of global emissions, but also buildings are just designed in a way that are not necessarily nice to be in. And cities are designed in a way that offend the senses, but provide us a lot of social complexity. So I invited Dror to this because he is an amazing designer and visionary who has brought a level of sophistication to solving the design challenge of how we build cities, urban environments, and villages that provide the social and economic complexity of a city with basically the natural human way of being, living in nature. Just a little intro. Actually, first, Patrick, do you want to say anything about Earthshot Labs before we jump into an intro on Dror? You can unmute yourself.
Sure. Hi, I'm Patrick, co-founder of Earthshot Labs, and I've also been collaborating with Dror on moving Supernature forward. Super happy to see some of our volunteers here. Thank you so much for your efforts so far. It's been a wonderful journey, and I'm really excited to see Dror here and hear more about the amazing architectural innovations that he's been pioneering at Supernature.
Yeah. So Dror, I won't do your full history credit, but in my understanding, you have been a designer for decades. Everything from product design, jewelry, small furnishings, interior design, and have more and more moved into architecture as a high-scale way of implementing design at the scale that's needed for the world. One really cool project that you've worked on is Narai, the sort of billionaires island residence in the UAE that has had a higher square footage sold per house, or higher cost per square foot than any other project in existence at that time. So it was really seen basically coming from a non-architectural background and then bringing innovative design thinking and nature-based, holistic and regenerative design in a way that really speaks to people, and has been able to do that in a way that I would say other sort of idealistic thinkers or sort of ecologically caring visionary people haven't been able to do, which is cross the barrier into real project implementation, where you can envision a world that is very beautiful and actually put together the resources and project expertise to actually go implement it on the ground. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Dror. And if there's any other intro things you want to share about the new project Supernature, which is the umbrella for the new development project that you're working on, and then just jump into a presentation. You're going to have to unmute yourself.
Yes, here we go. Here we go. Awesome. Thank you, Troy. Thank you, Patrick, for inviting me onto this platform. Before I'm going to share Supernature Labs and how we got to Supernature Labs, I put together just a little intro on my past career and my history over the last 20 years. I actually, let me just share and then take it from there. So yeah, way before I started thinking of the built environment, I was very much interested in the intersection of art and design. And I've always been fascinated with, this aspect that, you know, an artist doesn't have to necessarily commit to one particular discipline, to one particular design approach. And for me, it was actually much more interesting to think about the boundaries between certain aspects. So the very early parts of my career has been product design that plays a lot with transformation. I used to say that the two types of transformation that I care mostly about are physical and metaphorical transformational projects. And it took us into a very interesting career. The first 15 years of my career has been working on things that I never expected, right? Like from different collaboration with brands like Tumi and Bentley and Capellini and so forth, to various interior design challenges, and then the exploration of structure, which really got me to understand the logic of varying scales. And then I found myself kind of at the entry of architecture, where this whole idea of thinking about design typologies in a different way have various motivations and various justifications. So as you mentioned, the very first built architectural project was this, the Nurai project in the UAE, which really kind of shook our practice at the time, because all of a sudden we've completed $1 billion project in a very short time that ended up being and then through that project came a bunch of different similar and bigger projects in terms of scale, and pushed our imagination in terms of possibilities to a whole other place. I mean, this was an example of a vision project for an expansion of the city of Istanbul into the Black Sea. And all of those commissions, some of them have been built and some of them are not, have shaped this interest of mine to really create a cross-disciplinary approach that thinks about human experiences in a different way, and challenge the boundaries of possibilities. So yeah, those are a few various projects, until I got to a point where I realized that it's not just the experiences of people, but it's actually more about the experience of all life. And I think that at that point, projects are started to have a different interaction with nature. This is actually the port, Galata Port in Istanbul, which is currently under construction. It's the largest project we've ever been involved in, almost close to $5 billion in construction. But at that point, this idea of nature integration into architecture was fascinating for me and the practice. And we started looking at various ways of doing it, creating hydroponic structural system that can become, the base structural components for building. And through those exploration, I started to realize that we know very little about nature and the importance of nature in our life. So, inspired by local conditions and certain aspects in different projects that we brought, this is now in construction in London, Ontario, Canada. And then we stopped and said, okay, there's something that needs to change our practice. And this idea that the built environment is going to double over the next 30 to 40 years just kept, pounding in my head, because, living in New York and realizing that I have a very complex love-hate relationship with the urban environment, made me realize that this is a place we really need to focus on, and this is a place we really need to think about. And besides the fact that we're going to double the built environment in the next 30 years, the fact that we've consumed 50% of our natural resources already, those two facts did not sit very well with me. So, what is wrong with our cities? What is wrong with the built environment as we know it today has started to really take over my mind, and started really thinking comprehensively about urban planning strategies, about the use of material, the integration of nature in different way. And all of that kind of led to the fact that if we look at those built environments, we can kind of divide them into two aspects of creation: infrastructure and structure. And in essence, they are carrying very different motivation, right? The infrastructure is there to support, is there to give, and the structures are there to take. And there is no symbiotic relationship between those two groups. So, sprawl is obviously not the solution. And the fact that, if we don't want, there's only two ways for us to expand from what we've done over the next 30 years, right? It's basically vertically or horizontally. And the idea that, the suburban lifestyle is not just terrible for the environment, but it's also terrible for our experience. We have to drive everywhere. We have to pretty much have no access to all of the benefits of the cities. So the idea that we need massive change, the idea that we really need to think of a new typology, a new way of organizing ourselves in a different way, has been the motivation of Supernature. So roll down 4 years, we dived into a lot of investigations of soil and different benefits in terms of many aspects that I wouldn't even say are tied into, several particular disciplines. They're tied into so many aspects of the built environment. And we broke it into two tasks, and we decided to focus on one. So first, we need to improve the existing city center, and second, we have to stop the urban sprawl from continuing as we know it. And this is where we decided to focus first, is this idea of stopping urban sprawl. I always believe that it's much easier to start with a blank canvas and really think differently about this intersection between structure and infrastructure. And then once we have a clear understanding of what we should be doing, then we can adapt some of those thoughts back into, the problems that we have in existing city centers. So this idea of pushing towards the future of ecological harmony is quite different than what we call today sustainability, right? This idea that we need to build a little bit better than we've done before is simply not enough. And we have to take into consideration the fact that we need to understand where we're taking from, what we're doing, how we're living, and where does it end at the end of the day. So this idea of we no longer need to choose to live in density or to live in nature, and we can do both. We can live in density and in nature, has been the kind of striving point, the starting point. And it really starts with the fact that when we say communities, we don't just mean communities of people, we mean communities of all life. So this aspect of, designing for all life is really a collection of designing with nature, designing like nature, and taking into account that we're not the only species. So very early on in the investigation, which started with geometrical form, we realized that every living thing is organized in cell formation. And that kind of made us think on this large scale and started to understand that the logic of Voronoi pattern or hexagonal patterns is completely different than the Cartesianal logic that we're familiar with and the Cartesianal logic that all of our software are based off, and the way that we are currently organizing the built environment. So what can we learn from that? What can we understand from those forms that exist pretty much everywhere and exist pretty much in every scale? And how can we adapt from that approach and take it into the future of the built environment? Besides the fact that every cell is a self-sufficient entity that organizes and aggregate itself into an organism. So obviously, when we look at the Cartesian grid and the kind of traditional urban planning approach, we started looking at ways of shifting that and understanding what will it mean if we start organizing communities like cells. And those exploration blew our minds because we were able to see that we are actually able to create the same build environment ratio, but reduce the streets and circulation significantly. And actually, by doing that, get from point A to point B much faster and safer. So in this diagram, we're comparing the Manhattan grid, which have 56% built area and 43% roads and roads infrastructure, down to 18% of road infrastructure. And by doing that, actually including a quarter of the land as a natural environment. So how can this informs us in terms of us extending existing cities into new territories? Of course, cell formation have different ways. They don't all have to be relying on a non-Cartesianal. They can still be square and rectilinear forms. And the motivations for the type of sizes and shapes that we're creating, we've started to kind of identify various motivations. Some of them are cultural, some of them are land-based, climate motivations, and so forth. I'm going to touch on a few of those in a second. But through the exploration of various cell formation, we learned quite a lot about the experiences and what does it mean to reorganize ourselves in such logic. So first, the idea that a supercell is a replacement of what we call the superblock, and it's always a mixed use typology. Ideally, a supercell can provide the necessity of its community within the existing cell. And emotionally, I think it changes from this idea of organizing ourselves, next to each other and on top of one another in this very artificial order, to something that is more about building trust, something that is more about building communities that can meet in the center and enjoy the center, which is always a nature-based. You can think of those communities pretty much like massive roundabouts. So there are no longer four ways intersections. And what is the key aspects of ignoring the four ways intersection is that I don't have those type of conflict areas anymore. So I don't have, in the case of four-way, 16 points of collision, I only have 3 points of potential collision, which basically means I can reduce traffic signals. I can basically merge into the traffic and merge out of the traffic much easier. And that's why I can flow and move from one place to another. So through those exploration, we started to understand, well, what type of cells are logical for various places, and it starts with understanding the land use, the type of soil, the type of terrain condition, the type of climate, and the type of density that we want to make. And we started to algorithmically organize those motivations and start to kind of create a certain logic to all of that. So, when we say design like nature, it's already clear to us the enormous amount of benefits that we have by designing like nature. It's not all based on the idea of cellular logic, And the motivation of living with nature, it's also clear to us. And there are so many studies in recent years that are showing, improvements of cognitive functions and health and stewardship of the environment and so forth. So for us, it's essentially a new design logic, right? Like it's shifting away from thinking just human centric and really pushing towards a life centric approach, where we can now start to understand that we can bring in all of our needs and all of life into this logic. It gives us a complete new geometry to play with. It gives us a complete new geometry, which basically opens up enormous possibilities in terms of the build environment. And the motivations are not just on urban planning, the motivations are on space use and efficiency of inner space. People often ask me like, oh, does that mean that rooms are no longer, cuboid? And quite the opposite. You actually have much bigger variety of cuboid spaces within hexagonal based grid rather than a traditional com grid. So you can really kind of experiment with that type of vocabulary a lot more when you're free from just this um, rectilinear approach. So for us, supercell can vary in terms of size, in terms of shapes, in terms of density, in terms of height. We are pushing, of course, towards a modular construction base, a biophilic approach, and a regenerative approach. I think that it's big part of our responsibility. We have actually, and I'm going to talk about this in a bit, broken down the entire design imperatives of bioplanning into 16 very design imperatives that kind of touches on certain motivations. Just to, explain a few, and actually before that, let's just give a feel of what it's like to be inside of a supercell. The amazing thing also is that, of course, it is the first time where we are able to separate pedestrian path and micromobility from vehicular circulation, which I think for me is a major breakthrough, because the way that we've designed cities have always been based on transportation in recent years. The idea of connecting to nature and having a soil-based structure also relates to this idea of understanding the existing climate that you're in and optimizing for sun path. So all of the supercell have this kind of parabolic form that takes on the existing sun path, the yearly sun path, and carving that based on the type of density that we want to create. There's enormous benefits to that, but you can see how, in aggregation, the built environment starts to be so much softer, so much less mechanical, so much less harsh. And of course, we are completely agnostic to design when we're talking about those forms, right? It's basically just the massing logic that relates to the density, and then inviting, of course, various designers and artists and architects to implement their design into those types of forms. If we want, and we don't recommend, of course, we can go into a high density where it's really getting into a more of a high-rise approach, but we can talk about that separately. Part of what we're building right now is, of course, an AI-based algorithm that can understand all of those motivations and can actually show us how to optimize some of those decisions. All of the roofs are always green, And this is, I think, one of the key responsibility when we're talking about the fact that we took a piece of land and now we build a building on it and took away the breathing piece of earth from that spot. It's simply not enough for us to, replant somewhere else. We have to replenish that same soil that we've taken on top of the same exact footprint. So all of the roofs are green, and also, the aspect that being underneath of soil and vegetation gives us tremendous benefits of reduction in thermal benefit, both in hot climate and also in cold climates. And what if all of our roofs are basically responsible for our need of sustenance, right? What if they're all growing vegetation that serves the community? So yeah, here you see examples of both orthogonal units and cuboid shapes and hexagonal forms that I'm not going to get into that technicality in this talk because it's a bit, relates to um, structural benefits and the motivation of triangular logic, but also gives, larger window space, which gives better light and air, and greater exposure to all those balconies. Of course, if we're talking about lower densities, there are two ways to create lower density. One, to break the the supercell from one single building into various buildings, or of course lower the amount of floors. Um, and as I mentioned, this is not just for a place that does not have an existing infrastructure. You can also create, of course, rectangular block shapes with the same logic based on existing infrastructure. Um, One area that is very important is the aspects of construction automation, and whether we are deploying a single crane or different types of equipment that is getting deployed from the center, the benefits of having a circular path for your construction save tremendous amount of time. And it's clear to us that reduction of livable spaces in terms of cost in the coming years is a huge problem for us to solve, and automation is one of those aspects, and of course modular. So yeah, I mentioned a different design logic, and the goal is, triple bottom line: the benefits of the people, the benefits of the community, the economic, and the nature. In the coming weeks, we're going to launch what we call the first bioplanning design manual, which is basically an open source approach that shares the motivation, shares the design imperatives, and is open for everybody to continue to contribute to. And we're going to continue to publish new versions periodically. And then on top of that, I think the biggest key effort that we're working on is to establish an entire regenerative construction ecosystem with that approach that really introduces new system across all of our needs for the built environment that we want to create. That's it for my presentation.
Wow. So first, thank you, Dror. Um, I think something about your talk also just like touches me very personally and deeply, because I think all of us on this call get the sense that there's a way, like a fundamentally better way of living with each other, and that have structures that support those interactions with other human beings in nature. So just sort of like on a personal level and a visionary level, I really, really appreciate the fact that you are bringing rigor to something that is idealistic. So I just want to repeat that again. And the beauty of the images and the little video with the birds chirping, like, um, going into a city where that's actually a reality would be a dream come true in this lifetime. So I just want to thank you for that.
Thank you.
Um, we have a lot of questions that are popping up in the chat, and maybe the first one. This isn't exactly a question, but maybe just another comment. I'm reminded again of Christopher Alexander's a pattern language, where essentially what you are doing is creating patterns from a orientation of harmony with nature, harmony with each other. And for anyone who doesn't know that body of work, please go look it up. But it's essentially identifying themes of what cities and what buildings feel the best when we're in them.
Mm.
So, one, I just invite the entire audience. You're welcome to unmute yourself one by one, and or like physically raise your hand, or just unmute yourself and ask a question. Otherwise, I'll sort of manage questions from the chat and ask them to Dror. So first, if anyone wants to just pop in with a question, I'll let you go first.
Hey, Dror. I saw that me and I think Zaina had a very similar question here about it's just such a really fascinating approach to urban planning and planning in general. I think I have some experience in urban planning and in like general landscape use planning. And so I'm really interested in kind of the dichotomy between greenfield and brownfield development, which I think it seems like this is a really, particularly for brownfield development, I think this is a spectacular model. But I think Zane and I were both interested in this idea of old city centers and what opportunities you see for actually integrating this into existing infrastructure. And maybe if possible, like how you see that in terms of like grid tying or energy independence, and what kind of like, what are the mechanics there that you've been considering?
That's an excellent question. Thank you so much. A few things actually. So, people often ask me if we are giving up on existing city centers, right? Like creating a new reality and just let's shift to a new model and that's it. And the answer is absolutely not, right? The reason why we've started here is in order to take ideas from a carte blanche scenario back into the cities. I look at New York, that I'm very familiar with, and it's a city that in many ways I enjoy this simplicity of the grid in terms of orientation. And you basically say, it's so basic, right? Like I'm going up the streets and I'm going, left and right with avenues. For me, there's something actually that I realized that, what if we break that? What if we actually change that type of orientation and start close some inner street segments in order to create those types of, Cartesianal based cells and actually free those things? Are we actually going to be able to create faster moving traffic? Are we actually going to be able to create those inner gardens between, those streets? And we've created a bunch of models that we have not yet fully tested and went to traffic engineers to look at, and it's something that we obviously looking forward to doing. With this relationship with both Troy and Patrick, we started to think about the idea of inviting community to investigate some of those aspects together with us. So this is an invitation, right? Like this is an invitation to explore those kind of ways of shifting blocks into taking multiple blocks into single cell formation. And it can be the way that we see it right now. It will probably work best with an aggregation of 3 blocks together, 3 or 4 blocks, depending on how we're staggering traffic, whether you're corresponding to one-way traffic street, which then you do it every third street. Or if you're referring to a double way, then you're doing it every 4 blocks. Or if you have a combination, you can do it. That's one aspect. Second, you saw in the beginning a few examples of external facades that are vessels for soil and vegetation. Those could be add-on for existing buildings, right? Those could be basically extended balconies that we can create, and they can have an exoskeleton of themselves to existing facades. So all of those type of solutions, while we have the desire of making them all of ourselves, we want to encourage other to do them. And then once we have, an integrated platform that can host all of those solutions, they could be things that, communities can consume and order. And yeah, so those are two main things. Of course, there are many approaches about roof urban agriculture that is out there, and we want to integrate. But yeah, this idea of pocket parks, we can only do by conversion of existing asphalts, roads into demolish them and make parks out of them.
Thanks. That's really helpful. And I just one follow-up question about if you've done any kind of like microclimatic modeling or meteorological modeling with like EnviMet or any software like that to understand like what the urban heat island or some of the other kind of like air quality benefits might be.
Yes, so we're currently working with Bureau Happold in London to help us with a lot of those studies and questions. Their finding is incredible. I mean, we are actually blown away by the results that they are sharing back with us. It seems like there are enormous benefits of cross ventilation because of that shift from a 4-point block to a 6-point block, and obviously the increase 25% soil-based and nature-based helps with flooding issues, helps with microclimate of that type of inner vegetation. I mean, there are tremendous benefits that comes from that logic. A lot of them we still haven't captured yet in terms of study, and that's part of the next few months.
Thanks for the question, Tim. If there's anyone else that wants to pop in with a question, feel free to unmute yourself. Otherwise, I'll go ahead. Okay, so it's my turn. These are sort of like strategic questions. One, like, why has this not been done before? Like, why do cities look like they do? And the second part is, okay, so knowing where the future is going, like, how do we get there? And that can be like very pragmatically, like financial systems need to change in this and this way, or and I'm just curious what you're thinking about is like, why have we gotten to where we are now, and where are we going?
So it's an extremely important question. So first of all, in the early 20s, there has been a few proposals that create the assumption around hexagonal street grid. And nobody wanted to experiment with them, and they remain theoretical assumptions. They didn't really do what we're doing right now. They still relied on Cartesianal building and orientations of streets. Still had four ways intersections. The main reason why we have not done it before is we have to remember that until only 20 or 25 years ago, we only had a 2D based softwares to work with. And prior to that, we drafted everything by hand, right? With plans and sections. So introducing vocabulary that is not 90 degrees based is extremely complex. Today, of course, we're using 3D softwares. We have 3D manufacturing capabilities, and to analyze a cell base or a block base shape is identical. So that is the reason why I think we have not built like the cities like this before, right? Like in terms of organizing ourselves as communities in cell-based formation, that's not new. I mean, that's historically how we used to organize ourselves in tribes, right? But since Roman times, we started, carving those straight lines that evolved into, the grid that we are today familiar with. So that's just that's just in terms of, you know, the past and past capabilities. Um, Obviously, with the approach that we have right now, we're still relying on industrial process of manufacturing, right? Like in the future, where we completely free even from that, when we have all based on, you know, robotic 3D printing arms and free of forms, that complexity will get even further. But we are still kind of relying on industrial production for modular approach. Um, Moving forward in terms of models, what you're seeing here is a break in the disciplines that we are typically have, you know, fragmented our process. If you look at traditionally how developers are going about their project, they first hire, you know, an urban planner to create a massing study. Then they abandon the urban planner's master study and they go to the architect to validate that and to evolve that. Somewhere in the process, there is a landscaper team being invited to see how to address some of the leftover spaces. And then the engineer comes and changes certain things, and nobody uses the same software, so they're not really familiar with certain motivation or cannot really argue certain things. And then the project gets so far away from, you know, what it could become. um, I think that now we see so much more technological advancement in the ability to collaborate differently, and bringing people much earlier on to the discussion in order to create a very successful, um, you know, product. But I think that in terms of what is the ideal model, the financial aspect of a mixed use community, we need a lot more than what we've created so far. We need various new financial modelings, and a lot of other things that we have not yet tapped into.
So one thing I love this perspective, like sort of the techno utopian vision. Like I'm always a little bit skeptical of it as well. Like, okay, yes, we're going to technologize our way out of the problem and replace nature with our own solutions. But what you're actually saying is that essentially the advancement of technology is actually inviting like a deeper relationship with nature, providing more space. And so that's something that I can really get on board with, and I think is an amazing direction. And also like that introducing complexity into technological processes, for example, goes from our 90-degree street grids into something that is closer to biomimicry. So I just love that. James had a question. Also, shout out to the water team. One of our heads, team leaders of the water team, he had a question about water. What do you do with water? Are there impacts on stormwater, like runoff, water catchment? What are some of the impacts you can see on your design typology on water?
Yeah, so water is a very, very interesting aspect, right? Like, first of all, in terms of construction, this idea of changing from protecting our interior spaces with roofs that pushes the elements out, we want to do the exact opposite, right? We want to create vessels that contains water so we can actually benefit from harvesting, you know, what's available in that particular climate. And of course, you know, water, and there are various water solutions that relates to various types of climate. So we're not proposing a one fit all solution. There will be different things. Um, the I keep having Buckminster Fuller words in my mind in terms of demassing. The goal, the ultimate goal, is to be able to be completely independent from a grid, right? Completely independent and having the ability to and water is one of those issues that we're not there yet. right? Like we still need to rely on desalination plants in certain areas. We still need to rely on, pipes, main pipes that comes from certain sources. But I'm super excited about the advancement of collecting water from air. And when this is going to get to the point that we are completely going to be able to rely just on that. And yeah, so yeah, but in terms of pipes and managements, the non-Cartesianal logic still allows the same ability of pipes to kind of cross the community and feed, each cell in the same logic. So in that aspect, we're not making, it's not more complex because it's non-linear.
I also want to just throw in a little chime in. One of my dear friends, Andy Lipkiss, who founded Tree People in LA, he's like, LA is a city. No one really thinks about the water that comes from the rain. But if we just captured the water just on that city, it would be enough water for all uses, all human and all natural uses. And then we wouldn't have to go pump water from what was formerly a beautiful, the Owens Valley, and desertify an entire region just to provide our water systems. So this is sort of what seems like maybe a small question like, oh, what's the stormwater management system, actually has massive landscape effects thousands of miles away. So I just want to highlight the importance of that question.
Can I jump in?
Go for it, Eric.
Thank you, Troy and Patrick and Dror, for this. It's really inspiring and cool. I'm working on a project that shares a lot of the values and desires to have the same kind of impact. But I don't want to talk about that. I want to just see if I can get you, Dror, to talk about how in this framework that you're working with, how you're thinking about a couple things that are on my mind in my design process, which are transportation of people and goods in that higher density and taller structures. So I'm thinking of micromobility not on the ground floor specifically as a way to get rid of that two-dimensional plane that we put all of our transportation on right now. And what I'm seeing is that when the buildings are linked in that way in the cellular pattern, it creates this environment that's connected, so you could move around in it on different floors of the structures. That's really interesting. And then just to add on to that, what I don't think I'm seeing or what I'm curious and want to see is thoughts about how to integrate solar collection and storage and stuff, so that that's a challenge for me in my mind, that the rooftops are really valuable for green space and hanging out in and growing, food maybe, but that's also the prime location to capture solar energy if we're going to do that. And it's making me think of different shapes of solar panels and stuff that could be much more harmonious than the grid Cartesian structures we have for that.
Yeah. So there's actually a couple of diagrams that are not yet in this presentation that we're working on. One, when you talk about mobility, imagine this logic that pedestrian and micromobility can start flow between cells like neuron path, right? And you're basically connected to all of the neighboring cells within the environment. Now, to pass pedestrians from one cell to another, I don't have to be on the same plane as the road, right? Like it's much easier for us to do what they do in Europe, for instance, those tube underpass for pedestrians, which are extremely inexpensive, and they're not like road management that passes. They're just very lightweight type passes. What that does is an enormous improvement of flow of delivery trucks and emergency vehicles and and other mobilities. I'm not even talking about the future of self-driving and the fact that that will reduce the amount of vehicular in our streets. Just this idea of separating the interference of pedestrians within the existing need for sidewalks is tremendous. In terms of solar panels, so I have a couple of opinions about solar panels in terms of their real you know sustainability, but if you look at the amount of roof space that we have right now, we've basically increased the amount of roof space drastically. So we can use part of it for solar activities, and we can also have both, right? Like the idea that solar does not have to necessarily be instead of soil and vegetation. There are vegetation that are doing very well with shade, so solar can be their shading device, and still be on top of those roofs.
Yeah, thanks for that question. There's also a bunch of technology, solar windows, and then basically solar that lets a lot of the visible light spectrum through so that, greenhouses on top of buildings. So other techno-utopian direction. We're wrapping up our time pretty soon. And so maybe for sure, if you have any other questions, please go to our Slack channel. You can either ask me for an invite link, or we can send you the information over email, and we'll continue the discussion on the urban development channel. But sort of, last questions for Dror. There's a lot of people on this call and a lot of people that will listen to the recording, and a lot of people over the coming months as you release the bioplanning manual. How do you want people to engage with you, and what help do you need to actually make this into a reality?
Wow, that's the hardest question, I think. So one, it's clear to us that there are so much to add in terms of the understanding of existing systems that we have already that we are not aware of to utilize for this approach. So understanding what people are working on, what's available, by sharing it with us is extremely important. Exploring those urban patterns and approaches through the use of the bioplanning and sharing it back with us. I know that we're all going to learn more by exchanging this type of exploration. And that's part of the goal of this living document that we're going to have. And then once we get to release our technological platform and creating an open source for people to adapt various formations and various products, we're just not ready for that yet. So I don't know exactly how to invite to contribute on that aspect. Maybe it's more of a question to Patrick. Yeah, I think that reach out to us, consult with us, ask, how, we've spent years looking at all of those different aspects, and there's so much more that is currently not going to be included in the bioplanning that we have or that we are working on. So reach out and share with us and interact with the team and with the knowledge that we have.
Cool. So just adding to that a little bit, at least what I hear is that you're super open to collaboration, that architects, designers, developers, etc. feel free to reach out to you, or if you feel particularly passionate about this area, send him a note, send me a note. I also happen to know you're going to be working on some real on the ground development projects and engineering, prototyping, etc. So, funders, engineers, people who want to sort of like systemically and logistically implement this at a small scale and blow it up worldwide. That's what Dror is looking for. So, yes. Anything else? I just want to say a big thank you to Dror, also this entire community. I'm just really impressed how in the last couple months, so many people what have joined the Earthshot community. More than, we have probably 7 project teams right now. We'll continue the discussion on this theme on the urban design channel, but also if you're interested in other themes, whether that's, water, hydrological modeling, soil carbon modeling, forest carbon modeling, front end apps development design, we have a place for you in the community. We want everyone in the world to have a way to engage with direct climate and ecological action. So with that, I'm going to leave it. Thank you so much, Dror.
Thank you.